Let's get started here. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Tina Kempin-Reuter, and I am the director of the UAB Institute for Human Rights. I'm happy to welcome you today for our webinar entitled, What Now? Moving Forward on Police Reform. If you attended some of our past events, you know that together with the Lister Hill Center for Health Policy, we've been focusing on issues of criminal justice, racial disparities, and reforms all semester. With this being our last event of the semester, we wanted to bring in someone to offer up opportunities for students to get involved in affecting change right here in Birmingham. That being said, I have a couple of logistics to run through before I introduce our speakers. Today's webinar is made possible by the Office of Public Health Practice, the Public Health Student Association, the Lister Hill Center for Health Policy, and the Institute for Human Rights. I'd like to thank each of these organizations for their collaborations throughout this semester. Let me introduce our fabulous speakers for today. First of all, Brandon Johnson is a political economist and jurist who has spent his career working at the intersection of social justice, public policy, and urban planning to create social change rooted in equity and human rights. Brandon received his BA in political science from Morehouse College and his JD from DePaul University. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Brandon has deep roots in Alabama, with his family having lived in the state since at least the 1800s and in the Birmingham area since the late 1930s, including in Brighton, Brooker Heights, Ensley, Fairfield, and Smithfield. Currently, Brandon serves as the director of Mayor Randall Woodfin's Office of Peace and Policy. Before joining the Woodfin administration, he practiced law and served in leadership position with Westside Justice Center, Washington Park Consortium, and Catalyst Global Strategies. Always assessing policy through the lens of law, policy, and culture, Brandon works to craft and translate policies into effective actions that help people. His work has covered criminal justice, public health, violence prevention, and affordable housing, to name a few. He will have a conversation with our very own Jaylah Cosby. Jaylah is a graduate student in the Anthropology of Peace and Human Rights program here at UAB and a graduate assistant at the Institute for Human Rights. She also earned her BA in Communications from UAB and served as a Jefferson County Memorial Project Fellow. She completed the 2020 Summer Peacebuilding Institute at Eastern Mennonite University, focusing on transforming community spaces and restorative justice. Her focus is on examining the peace-building processes that communities practice after acts of racial terror and utilizing those same processes to heal communities still suffering from that trauma. I'm really excited for this conversation. So Jaylah and Brandon, take it away.
Brandon, I wanted to start off by asking you how you got to where you are. I know sometimes this path, or at least my journey into working in human rights, kind of started with learning about inequalities in our criminal justice system. And so that's when my eyes were open. But how did you get where you are doing this work?
Good afternoon, everybody out there. Thank you, Jaylah. Thank you, Tina, for the introduction. Again, my name is Brandon Johnson. I serve as the director of the Office of Peace and Policy for Mayor Randall Woodfin. I think there's no singular moment, and I think the more I reflect on my career, different moments kind of jump out to me. But I would say that I grew up in a very strong political culture on the south side of Chicago. Chicago is famous for its politics. I also grew up in a very strong Black community that believed in kind of political action. And I think actually the catalytic moment for me that really kind of cemented my path was the apartheid protests of the 1980s were very large on the south side of Chicago. And though I was, here in America, in my little corner of the world on the south side of Chicago, the learning about the struggles of, South Africans, Black South Africans under apartheid, and the struggles of people like Steve Biko and all that they went through, and the history of that nation, and tying it to what had happened in our own nation with Jim Crow and other forms of American apartheid. It gave me a lens towards kind of the universal experience and the deep links between freedom and human rights.
Sure. Yeah. I when you said your upbringing, your political and your community, that resonates with me. I have my background, my family, of course, took me to vote with them, and we sat at the table together to discuss policies from a very early age. So I definitely I resonate with that.
Absolutely.
What specifically about city government made you turn towards? I know you talked about a global perspective. What made you narrow in on city government?
Maybe two or three things. The first thing is, I think one of the first lessons I ever learned about politics was about the city state, and it always really stuck with me how powerful cities are within the context of our societies. And then as I continued to study and we began to, the earth began to flatten, and the Brookings Institute actually did a lot of work on kind of this nation of metros. But when you looked at the globalization patterns, it was actually an urban pattern, right? And so kind of, thinking about human rights, thinking about being impactful in your community, but still having a larger impact strategically in our global environment, cities seem to be the best and most strategic place to really make changes. And I think there are a number of policy examples across the world, even in what we would sometimes call repressive regimes, where cities really become the beacons of human rights. And so that became a very strong focus for me.
Yeah, and I think here recently, and then throughout history, the city has kind of been the stage for a lot of civil discourse and civil disobedience, and a way for the public to express its opinions and grievances to city officials. And so what do you think about protests, marches, and how effective they are as methods to do just that, for the citizens to kind of share their grievances?
Well, as many of the kind of progenitors of American civil disobedience remind us, particularly those that were leaders in the civil rights movement, it's a tool, not a tactic, right? And I think it's too much been a tactic. I think that, I'll be honest, I think the day of mass marches are pretty much by and gone. And I could argue why that is for a number of reasons, but that's no longer primarily how we communicate, right? So in 21st century world, particularly 21st century America, protests tend to, give privilege to the loudest, right? And I think that's kind of the other side of what we're dealing with in terms of human rights and civil discourse, is that we tend to give voice to the loudest when they're not always the full perspective. I think that in the age of ubiquitous, unscreened social media and multimedia platforms, the integrity of the demonstration is very hard to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
Then, depending upon the community, it is as much a vulnerability as it is an asset in the 21st century context.
Yeah,
I just
recently,
so I'm not poo-pooing on marches. What I do,
oh, I understand.
What I do think of is effective is articulating concrete policy positions, right? If you were to critique some of our most recent kind of civil disobedience movements, they were so focused on popular involvement and such that they never articulated actionable agendas, right? And so there's some danger there too, right? So tool, not a tactic, and it definitely is a tool that is strategically employed.
Yeah, I've recently, with the Institute for Human Rights, had the opportunity to talk to some foot soldiers from the march in Selma. And so it's interesting that you said using marching and those methods as tools instead, because they talk a lot about strategy, a lot about really the lack of strategy, the energy, and the frustration being there that's needed to kind of fuel those tactics, but the lack of strategy, and how important it is, even to down to kind of, I know in a meeting we talked about how one foot soldier was talking about how any person that was protesting or marching across the bridge, you could pick any one of them off and they could tell you why they were marching. They had a rehearsed script of when they were arrested, what action items they were asking for from the local government, from our national government. So I agree. I agree.
Right.
Definitely.
It's about, it really is about, you know, it is about effectiveness of communication, you know, and making sure that your voice is heard. And I think we have a number of avenues to do that in the 21st century that are far more powerful than in years past. And you also have to think about marching from your position, right? So, you know, in all systems where civil disobedience is used, it's already saying that you don't have access or full recourse within the civil system. And so it's also a tool that is to be exhausted once certain other remedies have been shown not to be available.
Right.
Right. So I think a lot of the problems we have now with marching is people are skipping the line. Right. Like you can't protest somebody you haven't talked to.
Right.
I find that a lot in city government, right? You have an open door policy, you have a grievance, I'm here to serve you, let me know. Right. But if the first time I hear from you is you protesting, then it does a lot to dilute the effectiveness of us communicating.
Yeah. With that though, how do students, say a grad student like me, any of the other undergrad students that are watching today, citizens in general, how do they get involved then? Through, I know you talked about kind of talking to someone first. So if that's a city council meeting or attending that, or jobs, internships with the city, like what does that look like, getting involved?
I guess it depends on who you are, right? I think that all level of civic engagement does not just happen through government. So I think, you know, first and foremost, volunteering and supporting those organizations that help people that you care about is a great place to start. And I think if somebody does nothing but that, they fulfilled their civic duty. Yeah. I think in terms of engaging government, I think as students, you train, you know, and I think part of that training is twofold. It's, you know, doing the hard work of reading the documents, studying them and understanding the systems you work in. And then two, it is availing yourself, you know, and usually at some financial sacrifice to put in some internships and some, you know, time on the ground in those crappy paying jobs to deepen your understanding. I always say that I actually do have a pretty strong opinion about training in government. I believe best practitioners are trained on a local level and on the ground. I often make the comparison, the difference between a state and local public servant and a federal public servant is a difference between the guy that works in the factory and runs the factory and the guy that trades the stock on the market. Like, so I think you need both perspectives, but I think the best place to be trained is on the ground. And then in general, I think all civic engagement requires civic literacy, right? I think that people forget that that government is a science and a very delicate art. And you know, if you're gonna engage, you should at least give yourself a basic literacy of how that thing works and what are the delicate balances that are being weighed every day. I think often for good reason, but far too often, particularly civil servants don't get the respect they deserve. You know, always liking it to, you know, you would approach your doctor with a certain deference and respect, right? You know what a heart is, you know what a lung is, you know what an arm is, but you don't off top supposed to know all the intricate workings of it. And I think people underestimate the complexities of our government, particularly as we kind of unwind this hyper bureaucratic state that we've created.
Yeah, I would even take it a step further. I know you talked about knowing kind of the basic ins and out, but I think that that's where academia has a really special place, because I think students, grad students, because I say myself specifically, there's an element of research that's there, learning, like you said it perfectly, that our government and this work is a science actually. And so there's a research element that goes into it. With the Institute of Human Rights here at the university, there's a lot of research that goes into it. And so I think it's really important to have that information about how to go about change, studying other systems that have done it effectively or have failed horribly, to give information to those practitioners. So yeah, but I don't want to give all of the credit. I want it to be balanced because we're talking a lot about what students and citizens can do, but I think on the other hand, city officials, to their credit, are doing a lot as well. So talk to me a little bit about what Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, its current approach to some of these issues.
Which issues?
We can talk about specifically broadly racial inequality. We can kind of go and narrow down into police reform and police brutality. Either way, we can go broad or narrow.
Okay. Well, so I think the first thing that the city of Birmingham and the Woodfin administration is doing is, you know, taking the issue seriously. And like you said, trying to get to the kind of root causes, right? I think we've been laser focused on having an accurate and actionable diagnosis of what the root cause of this is. So I think, and that's ongoing, right? Because a lot of this takes a long time to unravel. I think the other thing that we're doing is looking at what reforms we can implement, and this will be coming out next month, but what reforms we can implement given the current system and what we need to build, create, overcome to create a new system, right? So I think that what we are in recognition of is that government has not changed as swiftly as society has.
Mm-hmm.
And we are at a juncture now where that gap is untenable, right? I grew up in a turn of the last century home in Chicago. And I remember when I got to be about 11 or 12, you know, it seemed like every other light you turned on would blow a fuse. Well, essentially, we had to have the house rewired. When electricity came to that house, the TVs weren't as powerful, you weren't running computers, you didn't have all this digital stuff. The circuitry just couldn't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
I think where we're at right now is the circuitry of our government can't handle a lot of the changes in society. And so what we're trying to do first is reframe the issue. So Mayor Woodfin has been very deliberate about including a public health frame on a lot of these issues. And I think the beauty of a public health frame is that it allows you to look at factors that are far broader and that in years past under different lenses would be siloed, but public health lens can be seen as contributing to the same issues, right? So the fact of the matter is, if I look at, you know, your kind of stereotypical, you know, high-risk Black male, well, I can look at things like his income. I can look at things like institutional racism. I can look at things like housing, education, and not just whatever unfortunate crime he may or may not commit as a result of these other factors that are driving him towards a behavior that we know to be essentially a social disease.
Right.
I think that is the biggest shift. I think the biggest challenge that you will see is that, particularly around public safety. So structural racism, big, hairy, ugly thing, you have to chip away at that best you can, right? Because it's not something that's solely under the control of the city.
Right.
Right, so we also have to, you know, you think about, you know, public health in a socio-ecological model, where in these concentric circles do we sit, right? And so we have a very narrowly defined sphere of influence where we can affect things. Structural racism isn't one of those, but we can consciously address where we can. When you talk about it in terms of public safety, I think one of the great challenges is that there's a system and infrastructure that's as old as Birmingham, and we've always given resources. The trick becomes, I guess, you know, the way that elected officials always say, if you call the police, you want the police to come.
Right.
Right. And that comes with a number of challenges in a city like Birmingham, particularly because of the square mileage versus the low density. Right. So it creates large areas to patrol with not a lot of people in all those areas, which also means not a lot of tax base to pay for the level of patrol that everybody would like. And people still have to be kept safe. Unfortunately, what we don't control is that we are a very violent country, et cetera, et cetera. So when people do commit those acts, we want to be able to respond. We also realize that a lot of the people committing those acts have issues that if we get upstream, we can prevent them from ever becoming criminals. So the balance becomes, but we haven't invested any money in that over the last 100 years, right? Matter of fact, we've disinvested from it. And in disinvesting, we pretty much have lost a lot of those infrastructures that allow government to even be in that space, right? And so how do you, and revenues are lower than ever because of the pandemic.
Exactly.
How do you take something that's existing but perhaps inadequate to build something that doesn't exist while still maintaining public safety? So that's the balance that we're going through. What we'll be doing is there are very reasonable reforms that can be made to existing public safety policy, search warrants, use of technology, those kind of things that will enhance the service that officers are able to use to keep us safe. And then I think the other side is a lot of it starts with recognition. So the other side of, when people talk about, public safety reform and all of these non-police things, it really is a situation of our societal values, right? It's not just government, and it's not, government doesn't recognize the issue, right? So I can tell you right now, there's a huge crisis with regard to housing for formerly incarcerated persons, right? I can tell you that there is an over or close to 50% recidivism rate for people coming out of Alabama Department of Corrections in the city of Birmingham. I can tell you that a large number of those individuals that commit crimes that return them to jail will commit them in the city of Birmingham, right? But I can't get anybody to support me putting housing for ex-offenders on their block with their tax dollars, right? So a lot of, I'll give you one more example about recognition that my team and I are very passionate about. And this is another thing about perception and systems and all that other kind of stuff.
Right.
So I forget the exact statistic, but essentially, if your parents go to jail or go to prison, you're more likely to go to prison. Not only that, Birmingham being a 74% Black city with one of the worst state correctional systems in the country, there are a lot of Black people that are being incarcerated, a lot of Black parents, a lot of Black men. Birmingham Public Schools is over 80% Black. A lot of those kids whose parents are in prison are in the school system, right? They live in public housing. They go to their parks. We know that this is a traumatic event for them in their lifetime. I can't get anybody to, there's currently no program that acknowledges when you walk in the classroom every day that you're now either somebody's ward, because the parent that went to jail was the only person that could take care of you, or you're living in a stranger's house, or your parent that's left behind is overwhelmed in dealing with all these issues. We treat that child like they're going home to, this middle-class 1950s neighborhood with
nuclear family
and all that other kind of stuff, right? And so what I think the most powerful thing that Mayor Woodfin is doing is serving the people he has. I think too many people in government, to appease a lot of constituents, serve the people they want. And I think for all things that we're doing, even if we just do that, particularly from a human rights lens, if we can just accurately see the people that truly need our help, and interconnection between those populations, I think we win. And I think that's the big shift, is being people. When he says people, the mayor, the theme of his administration is putting people first. And essentially, he's now beginning to fully enact that in terms of public safety reform.
Right. Thank you, Brandon. I think we're going to turn it over to Dr. Roeder to get some questions.
Yes. I wanted to start actually with a question that, Brandon, you referred earlier to the marching, as a tool, and it's not very effective. What are some ways that you think are effective to promote social change? Like what would you say?
So what I would say is what I didn't extract from the marching, which we have other ways. Organizing is always important, right? Even if it's just your block club. And so what I would suggest is first organizing a constituency, right? It could be, a couple of families that are like-minded. a block, a neighborhood, join a pre-existing organization. You decide what's comfortable for you. I think the second thing is educating yourself and using that group to help educate yourself, hopefully with factual information. And then as you guys think about your interests and how they need to be moved, thinking about the proper tools and options to move your interests forward, right? And I think that depends on who you are as a group. I think you should always start with the civil regime that's set up wherever you live. So voting and showing up at board meetings is always a good place to start. And then I think you elevate from there, particularly depending upon the talents. And I think what I would say about being engaged in governmental processes versus protesting is, I think you can have the same effect, particularly if you're savvy about being on a record. Some of the most effective community groups, it's not the same person every week, but every week is somebody speaking for that group and they're on the record. So that's what I would say is my short answer.
Thank you. I would like to invite the audience to please submit your questions. We already have a couple, so I want to start with the first one that asks about examples of system level inequities that are being addressed under the Woodfin administration. And the person would like to know who they can contact or email to get them to act.
Can you tell me the first part of the question again? I missed it.
What are some of the examples of system level inequities that are being addressed under the Woodfin administration? I think you mentioned some of those, but it seems like there's some interest in maybe digging a little deeper.
So I would say to start, you could contact myself or Denise Gilmore. We both fall within a division of social justice and racial equity, and we can be more in depth. System-wide inequities, I'm not sure quite what that means, but I'll answer it two ways. Topically, we've looked at human trafficking. We've looked at any number of issues concerning immigration and undocumented persons. We're looking at homelessness, looking at reentry. I would say that we're looking very heavily at investment in minority and disadvantaged businesses, and in fact have begun a very significant overhaul of how we use city dollars to encourage economic growth in those areas, including dedicated staffing to that. We are looking at transportation equity. We are, there's Shape BHAM. If you look at it, we've looked at essentially health impacts based upon built environment, such that our development strategies have environmental justice embedded in them. And then the other thing that we are beginning to do, again, we are a city without home rule within the state of Alabama in the United States. So our authority is what it is, but we're making more deliberate and intentional connections to other units of government and other systems, so that at least in our little neck of the woods, we can use coordination and collaboration to deliver more equitable services.
Thank you. The next question actually comes from Dean Irvin, and he says, Brandon, it's good to see you. And his question is about his question is about COVID and how the COVID pandemic has impacted the peace initiatives as it relates to reducing homicide.
That's a good question. So, we've kept moving as in office. We've continued to move. We did what everybody else did. We pivoted. We got, a new WebEx subscription and some cameras, and shifted money to laptops and that kind of stuff. So that has we've kept moving. I think we're all figuring out, particularly where there is a need for deep interpersonal connection, how to do that virtually. And I just want to make sure that I address, of course, a lot of the protocols have been really impactful just in terms of you don't realize how much person-to-person interaction makes a difference until you can't do it. So I don't want to underplay that, but that's been the major change on the city side. I think more alarming is that essentially, I think one of the most underreported things about the pandemic is essentially the criminal justice system came to a screeching halt. Mm-hmm. And it's no longer, it's not fully functional yet. So you have, you know, various entities don't want to take prisoners. So be it, and for those that don't know, essentially the way that our prison system works is you're essentially, however you want to look at it, filtered up or filtered down, right? So you get arrested by a local person, you go to a county person, and you go to a state person. Well, nobody wants to take anybody right now, right? And I think there are good health reasons that that was looked at, but it happened at a pace that there wasn't a lot of discernment. Similarly, we're figuring out how do you have fair judicial processes within this context. So there is a tremendous backlog. How does that affect our initiatives? It means that one, alternative programs have come to a screeching halt. Two, those people that should be off the streets, it's harder and harder to get them off the streets. And then I guess the third thing I would say is that, I mean, your academics, we talk about COVID fatigue and the stress on households, but when you see it on the TV, you know, these are middle class and better people dealing with, oh my God, I can't stand having my 2-year-old in my office all day. When you move down the socioeconomic bracket, this is creating new levels of violence. A lot of it stemming from domestic issues and interfamily issues. And the honest truth about that is that's damn near impossible to police.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, I can see, you know, specifically with regards to criminal justice, but also generally some of the social justice initiatives that you have. Like when you mentioned earlier that the, you know, the focus of the Woodfin administration is to serve the people that you have, you know, that a lot of people that is more difficult to reach in these times, right? In underserved communities because maybe of, you know, broadband access issues and those kinds of things. Like sort of, you know, going off of what you just said, what are some other ways in which you're trying to reach communities, especially in underserved areas of the city?
And to kind of, you know, make the link, something that has been a tremendous impact is the number of individuals comorbidities has taken out of the game. Mm-hmm. Right. And, you know, Black community has higher rates of obesity, heart disease, et cetera. So a lot of the people that really are frontline people can't risk going out there. And then the other side of that is, particularly for the community and families, is, you know, the number of elderly people that were taking off, right, that serve so many functions, particularly around really counseling and childcare, right? And so those are also very destabilizing factors, again, in which we had not invested the systems that were being handled informally. Now that there is a need for a formal system with a great deal of capacity, it's just not something that we've built.
Right. I mean, you talked about collaboration. Are you working with other actors, you know, like nonprofit organizations and, yes, you know, other resources? What are some of the ways in which you collaborate with those?
I think what is done is, you know, we've always, particularly in our office, but as an administration, tried to have a close relationship with community-based organizations. But other side is it has put, I would say, more workload on them,
Mhm.
right? Because there are things they can do that we can't.
Right.
You know, that's the other thing is that, which is a difficult, you know, we're not talking about theory, we're talking about actual governance, right? Where there's people's lives on the line at the same time with government, right? So we know the public health guidance. So take a lot of our buildings offline, right? At very minimum, as government, we have a duty to uphold the standards we know will keep people safe. Distancing, masking, all that. So all of our places where kids and all those people would gather, they're at reduced capacity if they're open, right? And everybody's seen that play out. But where do these people go? And is it safe, particularly around children? It's not safe for every child to be at home.
Right. Yeah.
So now we really do have to work with people and say, you know what? We understand what the standards are, but we have real concerns about this child being either physically and sexually abused at home. We're gonna have to take our chance. And I think that's where community organizations and churches have been very helpful, but it's been difficult because you're still balancing the public health guidelines. And the real truth is, again, there's just not that capacity in the system.
Mhm. Right. There's a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is about a new housing development in the works downtown that will look nicer, but displace a lot of residents who need Section 8 benefits. What will happen to these citizens and what is the city doing about it?
I will defer you to our Department of Community Development. And I'm not sure exactly which housing development they're talking about, because there's a lot of Woodfin administration has prioritized affordable housing. There was a deficit, now he's addressing it, so there's a lot of construction going on. I know that I have sat in on meetings where mitigating displacement is a very real priority. And then the other side I would say is that I would, defer to our Department of Community Development, but again, around us having limited authority. If this is a housing authority development, then the city has a influence and a role it can play, but does not govern what that is. And then in terms of displacement, because I have a long background in public housing from my work in Chicago, it's a challenge, particularly if you're dealing with public housing that was concentrated units. Because the fact of the matter is, no matter what improvements you're going to make, if that's old housing stock that wasn't maintained, it has to be redeveloped. And those people have to go somewhere, live somewhere doing redevelopment. And depending upon what that time frame is, it creates different issues. But it is a priority to mitigate the best we can.
Thank you. We have two questions that go back to the question of the criminal justice system and police reform. Someone is asking, what low-hanging fruit type policy changes can we advocate for that can improve community policing and the criminal justice system? And are there examples of impactful policy or programs enacted in other communities that would that you would like to see implemented here?
I would say look forward to December. There'll be a pretty significant report coming out to that effect. But I guess my short answer would be that particularly under the leadership of our current police chief, Chief Patrick Smith, direct engagement with the police department works. I think so I would say if you have ideas, particularly if they're around your community, the police department I know is very open. Two, they do have like the Citizens Police Academy and volunteer opportunities, which do serve as really good ways to build that rapport. as you learn more and more about why they do what they do and how they do it. And then they recently started over at Morton Simpson, which we hope to expand. And I think I forget which part of UAB is partnering with us, but the Safe Passage. So we have been engaging community members with creating safe passage routes to and from school for elementary students. And so those are the type of opportunities we're looking to build out.
Gotcha, thank you. What can the city do to support children who have a parent missing from home due to incarceration?
One, if you are interested in supporting, reach out to my office. I can definitely point you in the right direction. I think we have to start to raise their voices as a community. So, you know, first beginning to educate yourself about what impact that has on children. And then two, I think as a community, we just have to begin to see and recognize them in ways that are supportive, you know. But there are any number of local organizations that, you know, I just got off the phone with one this morning. They're gonna give 8 families $500 gift cards for the holidays, and they have food pantries and those kind of things. So I think the other side of it is the reason I called out that population is if you're supporting children in need, you're likely already supporting one of them as well.
So considering, you know, the times we are in, I'd be really interested in, you know, hearing more about how you kind of determine the greatest needs. Like, how do you get direct input from the communities that are most affected by COVID-19 and poverty and so on, to find out what their greatest needs are? Because in my experience, right, often what we might think are the greatest needs are not necessarily what people specifically want, like, or their concrete needs in that particular moment.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna be considerate of the audience and I'm gonna give you my kind of wonky nerd answer. But
I love it.
At the beginning of the year, one of my team members that serves as a deputy director, Mosi McCory, and myself met on a Saturday at the Uptown in the Sheraton to kind of lay out what our strategy and approach was going to be. And should have known the pandemic was coming. It was the beginning of the year, because this is when Chan School of Public Health from Harvard was really, really prominent, started to become real prominent on NPR. But one of their philosophies, so we had a debate, were we going to be an interdisciplinary team or a transdisciplinary team? And so we're literally sitting on our computers and like trading definitions and, well, this scholar said this, but we settled on transdisciplinary, because the goal was not to keep people in their silos, but to create new ways of doing things, new analytics. So we said, well, we definitely need that, because this interdisciplinary stuff hasn't been working anyway, whatever. We're for the transdisciplinary. But then what also occurred to us was that we could have that same rigor, but with a more expansive team. Mm-hmm. So to your point about hearing the people are part of our team now. And that's a constant strategy, right? So our Office of Reentry is essentially led by a man that served 18 years in prison and is in the community every day, and a woman that, you know, did 6 months in federal prison and is still on federal probation and has to work every day with women and children in her position. And so I think taking this transdisciplinary approach, because I think, you know, I don't know that, and I'll get to a data point, but it's not so much, it's listening and hearing from the right people, not from everyone, that matters. As a practical, you know, everybody has an opinion, that's great, but if you master the art of finding the right people to hear and listen from, more often than not, you'll get it right. And then the other thing is data. And there are a lot of civil liberty issues around data. I get it. But, you know, I've come to a point for a number of reasons that I think, you know, the era of big data has come for progressive human rights causes. It's necessary. It's necessary because it's the only way that you can begin to make the argument for the level of investment you need. And it's the only way that you can begin to coordinate the resources, create the continuum of care that you need to support people to be healthy, you know, free individuals in our society. I'll go back to the, you know, these youth, the highest impacted youth in Birmingham. So there's a child right now in Birmingham whose housing needs are met by public housing through the Housing Authority Birmingham District, whose educational needs are met through the Birmingham City School System, another unit of government. These are two separate units of government. Their health needs are met through some combination of state funding, some kind of Medicare or whatever, and, you know, essentially indigent care from the county or hospitals. And God forbid there's some other issues around custody or whatever, the overall welfare is overseen by the court system. None of these systems talk, right? So this child and his or her family have to navigate all these systems independently without the expertise of how to coordinate it, without the support. Meanwhile, eating away at endless hours of bureaucracy and time out of their day to get these services that ultimately, yeah, it helps them, but it benefits us all by making us a stronger society. And I think a lot of that has to do with data sharing and for lack of a better word, case management. You shouldn't be able to touch government 10 different times and nobody know that you've done it. So I think that's kind of the way that I think you get to the root of what community truly wants and needs.
Right. Yes, no, I definitely agree. I mean, especially if you have sort of a mixed method approach, right, where you have big data, but you also have, you know, some direct interaction with the community itself, which it sounds like you do. Our last question for today is actually one for Jaylah. And someone is asking, as a human rights student, can you tell us about any comparative examples in general, or in general, that have been able to make positive changes for the police force or policing, or have had positive outcomes?
Sure. I guess I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer that question as it relates to police reform. But I know a lot about trauma work as it relates to specifically lynching, because that's what my research is in. But I think it translates as well in as well as police reform. So I'm looking at how other methods, whether it's through arts or community activities, and how that helps to heal communities after an act of racial terror, specifically lynching. And so I just think there's a good amount of research that could help us and other entities of the government, not just the police, but how to interact with communities based on their history of trauma. So I think there's research out there, and I think it's, like Brandon mentioned, kind of utilizing that data.
Yes, and we can definitely learn a lot from other places, right? Like Northern Ireland, for example, specifically for police reform, you know, some of the ways in which they have integrated a originally very one-sided or very, you know, Protestant Unionist police force into one that's more trusted. But as you said, I think trust building is really important
Yeah,
here.
Japan as well is another example.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah, and some of the topics obviously Brandon has brought up today. All right, well, I want to thank you all for this fascinating and important discussion. Special thanks obviously to Brandon for taking out time out of his busy day.
Honor was mine. Thank you.
To share your expertise and talent with us, and to Jaylah for expertly leading us through this conversation. I would like you to again to thank all the co-sponsors of this event, and also to the captioner who provided accessibility for this event. Thanks to all attendees, and as I said, we will make sure to post a recording of this discussion. If you have additional comments or questions, or would like to get in touch with Brandon or us, right, you're certainly welcome to email us either at ihr@uab.edu or for the Lister Hill Center at lhc@uab.edu. Thank you, everyone, and
and we're at peaceandpolicy.com. All our contact is at peaceandpolicy.com.
peaceandpolicy.com. Thank you very much. All right, everyone, have a great afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. I enjoyed it.